Hey, Cheryl, really excited to have you on the show. Thanks for hosting me on your podcast, Edit History. And also, we've always had a lot of fun conversations in person at our podcaster meetups, which always are a lot of fun because, when you put five podcasters, everyone's a really good conversationalist with lots of fun tidbits. And you're one of those people who have a really interesting story. So, Cheryl, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cheryl Lau, and I'm a podcaster. I am the host of the podcast Edit History, and I also work with entrepreneurs and creators to build a substantial and compelling body of work.
Yeah, amazing. So let's go back to the beginning, right? Because you have an interesting, kind of like undergraduate and academic history. And the crux of it is, you've been somebody who's doing a lot of research, but you also dropped out of two programs, one in law and one in PhD, which seems like a nightmare. So could you share a little bit about what was going on in terms of your academic career?
Growing up, I consider myself your stereotypical straight A, very good Asian child, like very studious, very quiet, very nerdy, a little awkward. So I got all the good grades, top of the class. And when I went into university at the University of Toronto, that continued. So the defining descriptor I would use to describe myself growing up is very studious and play by the rules, check off all the boxes. And so when it was time for graduation, and then after I graduated, I had been checking off all the boxes up until that point. And I'm like, okay, what other box can I check off at this point? And law school, it made sense in my head at that time, but I did not really do any self-reflective work to really understand what are my strengths, what are my interests, and what kind of work do I want to do for the next however many decades in my life. So I went into law school kind of blindly. I even got a scholarship. So I went to a law school, a postgraduate law school in Hong Kong, and I even got like a 100,000 HKD scholarship to go there. So when I first entered law school, everything sounded perfect on paper, right? My parents were happy, like their daughter's going to be a lawyer. It all just seemed to make sense in my head at the time. But very quickly, when I started law school, it wasn't so much the subject matter or the studying that felt off, but it was once I started doing my internships when I realized something is really off. And that's very rare for me to think, because I'm someone who, if you give me some tasks, I will do it. Like I will do it well, and I'll do it on time and do it well. But when I got into my internships and I had to do very basic legal tasks, and I felt so much, it felt so dry, it felt so sterile, something felt really off. And I don't know if it was like a quarter life crisis at the time, but it really felt like I could be using my strengths and skills and interests somewhere else. I feel like I could do better somewhere else. I couldn't quite pinpoint it at the time, but I think looking back, it was like a mix of, because I think at the time, a lot of people thought I was really dumb for wanting to quit law school, because my parents were like, why can't you just finish the degree and at least have a degree in your pocket before you go do something else? My classmates were talking behind my back and they were saying like, oh, she's going to quit law school. Rumors were spreading. And at the time, I couldn't quite understand why I wanted to quit, but there was just such a strong nudge and like a inner knowing that told me, no, this isn't the right direction, and you better change paths before you continue putting and investing more time and effort into this path. So I eventually, after the first year, I quit law school. And then afterwards, I needed to make a living because my parents were mad at me. They weren't going to support me anymore. So I needed to make some money. So I applied for a number of research assistant jobs in Hong Kong. And ultimately, I started working as an RA at the Chinese University of Hong Kong for a few years. And I loved it so much that I decided to apply for a PhD. But then I started my PhD in 2020. And at the time I thought, oh, this COVID thing is only going to last for 6 months. But it didn't last for 6 months. It lasted for 3-4 years. So as the PhD progressed, things felt harder and harder because my partner and I, at the time we were doing long distance between Hong Kong and Singapore, we did not see each other for 2 years. So emotionally, the PhD felt really difficult because I could not see my then boyfriend, now husband, for 2 years. And at the beginning of 2022, I decided to leave the PhD as well to move to Singapore. So that's a quick overview of my career journey.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that, you're probably like every Asian parent's worst nightmare, right? I mean, I would be like, wow, I was really proud of you for going for law school. And then she dropped out, right?
And then it happened again.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, and then now she's like, oh, she's doing a PhD. Okay, fine. She's going to be Dr. Cheryl Lau. And then you're like, oh no, she chose love. I mean, I don't know. I think if you like the guy a lot, maybe it'll be okay. He's like, oh, this is a good son-in-law. Then maybe it's okay. But yeah, how was that conversation? Was informing them that you're dropping out for a second time easier the second time around?
It was. It definitely was, because there was a big key difference between the first dropout and the second dropout. The first dropout, my parents really felt like you're just half-assing things. You're just a quitter. Like, you had so many resources. You got a scholarship, you had resources, you went to a good university, you had all these opportunities, and you don't even know, you're so immature. Like, it made no sense to them. And it made no sense why I couldn't just at least get that JD degree first. So at that first quitting juncture, they felt like I was just being a quitter. And they felt like I wasn't taking responsibility, I wasn't responsible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the time period between the first quitting and the second quitting, I also pursued a lot of different things. Besides my research jobs and starting the PhD, I also started to create my own online business. I started podcasting. I even tried different gigs, like tutoring, being an assistant to a local executive coach in Hong Kong. I did several different things. And I think what that showed my parents during that about 4-year time span was Cheryl actually takes responsibility over her decisions. Because during that time, I never complained to them. I never asked them for money, never asked them for emotional or financial support. And I think that reflected really well with them. I think they felt like, you know what, now that we've seen Cheryl really keep her word to herself, take responsibility and make things work, right? To a certain extent, make it work. They felt more trust that I can take care of myself. So when I told them the second time that I'm now leaving graduate school, they're like, okay, I mean, we like the guy that you're marrying. So like, okay, that's fine.
They're like, wow, good son-in-law. We like him.
I'm sure that helped too.
We were ready for grandkids. I mean, I don't know if you want kids, but I mean, I can imagine Asian parents were like, oh, this is the fastest route to a grandkid. So, in my stacked rank of like doctor versus grandkids, well, I got to trade for one. I got to take the one that's in front of me, right?
You know what? I think to a certain extent that thought probably creeped up on their minds at some point. I think it did.
Yeah, 100% they discussed it very explicitly, but they didn't say it in front of you. So, that's fine. And I think what's interesting is that, you made obviously those set of decisions, and you've made a set of decisions to also build out kind of like a coaching as well as a podcast business. So could you share a little bit more about how you thought about that?
So the reason why I started podcasting and building content on the internet, I think it's twofold. I think number one is I've always been enamored by the idea of having a body of work. I think I grew up in a very academic environment. A lot of my classmates now are actually lawyers, actually medical doctors, PhD doctors. Like, they're very successful in their own right. So, and a lot of academics that I was surrounded with have an academic body of work, a lot of publications, publish or perish. So I think since I was in university, I've always thought, you know what, one day I'll have my own body of work. And I didn't know what that could look like. I thought it would only meant academic journal peer review publications. But I think when I stumbled across the space of online content creators, I thought that might be it for now. I don't know if I might have my own academic publication body of work one day. But for now, I want to build a body of work in some way. So creating content was one way I started doing that. Another reason why I started this coaching business, started this podcast, is because when I was quitting law school back in 2018, I felt very unsupported, very confused, very judged. But what was interesting was at the time, I just happened to come across a stranger on Instagram, on my Instagram discovery feed, where she was just sharing her own experiences of quitting her very prestigious corporate job. And it was just exactly what I needed to see, read, and hear at that point in my career, because no one else around me really understood why I was feeling this way. But I saw that someone else, a stranger on the internet, her story resonated and helped me so much, even though we did not know each other. And that's when I realized there is probably someone else who I can help in some way. It might be a very naive thought, but I really felt the impact that someone else had on me. And I wanted to do the same for someone else. So that's how I started creating content online and started building eventually a business around it as well.
Amazing. And what's interesting is that, you've been learning podcasting and obviously that overlap with your move to Singapore and Southeast Asia. So could you share a little bit more about what that geographic move meant while you're also reestablishing, I think, your geography, you're moving closer to somebody you love, and you're also kind of like reinventing yourself in terms of your business. How did that shake out?
Honestly, the first year I moved here, I was like grieving. I was really grieving because I was really looking forward to building my career as an academic before I decided to quit the PhD and move to Singapore. I I I felt like at that time when I moved, I felt like I was giving it up for this guy. But so there was honestly, like, even though when I first moved here, we got married and then we moved in together with my in-laws for the first year and a half. Even though I knew that these were all decisions that I was very happy making, I still felt a little bit of anger, a little bit of resentment for whatever reason. I felt I felt like, why do I have to give up my career for this relationship? Why couldn't he give up his career for this relationship? So to be honest, that move, that relocation, that starting over journey, I felt a little bit moody. I was kind of moody for a long time. But I think what happened eventually was, I think time does heal a lot of things. But also, number two is realizing that because looking back at my own history, I have made a lot of career decisions, a lot of drastic career decisions, such as quitting law school. And yet I still was able to take responsibility for those decisions and stay committed to those decisions. So applying that thought process, I applied it here once again. And I thought, okay, if I'm quitting PhD, if I'm relocating my entire life to a new country that I'm not a citizen of, I'm marrying a person forever, like all these big decisions, if I can apply the same thought process, I think that calmed down the chatter in my mind a lot. So to kind of summarize, I think number one is I felt more grounded eventually once I realized that this is just like any other decision that I'm making. There is no right or wrong decision, but it is a decision that I'm willing to try and commit to and make it work.
Yeah. And you've built this podcast over the past few years. What have been some lessons that you've had? Because I know that there have been, I think, for example, name changes, right? So if this was initially the Side Hustle Club, then became the Thought Leader Club, and then now it's Edit History. So I think obviously there's some evolution in how you're thinking about the names, but also perhaps the purpose and audience. So could you share a little bit more about that process?
For me, I realized that we are inevitably going to evolve and mature. I think that's probably the more important word here, is that we always will mature in whatever initiative that we're pursuing. So when it came to my podcast, what started out as a side hustle club, I was basically just narrating my experiences as a side hustler. I started my business when I was working full-time as a research assistant in Hong Kong. And I was side hustling on the side, building this podcast, building this brand, building this coaching business. So I was really just documenting my experiences at the time. And then when I quit my PhD and I was pursuing my coaching business and podcast business full time, I realized that maybe my identity as a side hustler doesn't really hold up anymore. But also, I wanted to dive more into this idea of thought leadership because I've always felt that thought leadership isn't necessarily something that is based on your credentials, how many accolades you have, or even how many years of experiences you have. But it's really, the way I see it is, are you using the perspectives and experiences that you have to do something good in this world? Are you building something with those ideas and thoughts and perspectives to add value to the world? That's kind of how I see thought leadership. And I wanted to champion that idea. So I wanted to rebrand my podcast to reflect this message that I was such a champion of at the time. And why it is now evolving into the next iteration, Edit History, is because I honestly, for the past 4 years of podcasting, I was mostly doing a solo monologue style show. And I feel like I'm starting to run out of things to talk about, not gonna lie. I think sharing about my experiences, yes, we will learn new things every single week. Every single day we learn new perspectives and we learn new things about ourselves. But I honestly felt a little bit plateaued at my own growth. And I thought, you know what? I think it's time for me to bring on other perspectives and really learn from them and really put myself in a learning position again and have a conversation, have a dialogue on their body of work. What are they building? So that is how my podcast has reflected the different evolutions that I personally am going through.
Mm. And when you think about edit history, what is the meaning and thought behind that choice of name? Because naming something is hard, right? I mean, I had to name 2 daughters and there was a big hoo-ha spreadsheet debate. So, I mean, obviously naming a kid is one thing. I guess we can't change the name of our kid the same way we change the names of our podcasts. But I'm just kind of curious from your perspective.
So, Edit History is a show where successful entrepreneurs and creators revisit, review, and maybe even roast the content that got them to where they are today. So, we are essentially looking back at their quote unquote edit history, their past content pieces. I literally have guests bring me a piece of their past work and we will rip it apart, we will analyze it, we will critique it. What would you do differently today? Why did you do this back then? And really show to the audience that, you know, as a creator and entrepreneur, you will evolve, you will mature, and your content will likely showcase that evolution as well. And for the listeners right now who might feel like their content is not quite where they want it to be, maybe they feel like it's not their own voice, they've been taking a lot of heavy inspiration from someone else. It's okay. It's okay if you feel like that right now, but know that there is a growth opportunity for growth. There is a path forward. And that is what Edit History does, is I want to show people that there is an evolution.
Amazing. So what are some, aspects about podcasting that you find that most people don't really understand, or there's some myths or misconceptions about being a podcaster?
That's a great question. I think the biggest misconception, because I think for a lot of people who are not podcasters, when they think of podcasters, they only see the big names, the really established full production team podcasts. So the misconception, I think, is that podcasting requires a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of effort. And I don't disagree with that per se, but I think people don't think that it is something that they can do themselves. I think a lot of people who come to me, a lot of podcasters who come to me, they always say that they're worried they can't actually keep up with this because there's so much that goes into the production, the pre-production, the post-production, the marketing of your podcast, and they feel like it's not possible. But one thing that I find that I've been able to do is I'm actually still to this day, 4 or 5 years later, I'm still a solopreneur doing all the podcasting by myself. The scripting, the planning, the editing, all of that I do by myself. So I think the misconception is that people think it's not feasible. It's not realistic for them to have a good podcast to the quality that they want. But I just want to at least offer a different perspective, which is sure, like maybe you may not start out with like recording at a studio. You may not have a team of editors behind you, but there is still opportunity for you to build a body of work through your podcast that is of quality and of substance and doesn't take away like your whole entire 24/7.
Yeah, very true. And when you think about the future for kind of like edit history and what you want to achieve, how do you see your own kind of like career, ladder or ambitions as of today? What does that future look like for you?
It's a really good question. That's a hard question. I would say that I see myself, I see edit history playing a role in my, at least in the next 5 to 10 years. How I see this podcast playing a role is that I want edit history to show that Cheryl is really good at thinking about content. So that's also one reason why I'm changing the format from solo episodes to more of a conversation dialogue. I'm not necessarily positioning me or the guest as the expert, but rather me and the guest are having a very critical, reflective conversation about content together. So I want both of us to showcase our critical thinking skills. So that's also one reason why the format is changing, because I want my audience to see that Cheryl can likely help me with my content because she actually has interesting perspectives or very critical commentary on content in general. And how that feeds into my own career or business model is that I help entrepreneurs and creators build a body of work. Oftentimes we co-work together, we co-strategize together, we plan and write content together. So by showcasing how I think on my podcast, that naturally showcases how I can help them in a coaching capacity. So that's how I'm thinking about the business model in the next few years. But if you were to ask me, how does edit history look in the next 5 to 10 years? I don't know, but I'm very confident I'll still be podcasting. That's all I can say for now.
Why do you enjoy podcasting?
That's a really interesting question, because I think podcasting to most people is just the medium to deliver a message. And I think I agree with that as well. But I think why I enjoy podcasting as a medium is because this will sound a little bit what's the word? It's like self-promotional, but I've often gotten the comment, Cheryl, you have a nice voice. Like I get that comment a lot. And I don't see it. Like I can't hear it. Like I don't think it sounds particularly better or nice or whatever. But I do think that podcasting lets me play with my strengths, which is using my voice to articulate and express my sincerity, express my thought process. I think my voice allows me to express my thoughts, and it resonates deeper than just written word alone. So I think that's why I particularly enjoy podcasting, is that I think the resonance is much stronger than if I were to just type out my words on a keyboard.
And in terms of resonance, what kind of content do you think is resonant in the world today? Is it, like you said, critical thinking? Is it about thought leadership? Is it side hustles? It feels like it changes quite a bit. So how do you think about creating content that is resonant?
I'll start by thinking about what may not be as resonant. I think I don't want to use the word generic here, but I think content that can be easily Googled or generated by AI, I think may not be as resonant because it's it's easier. I think the barrier to entry is easier. But whereas for content that might involve either more storytelling, because storytelling I think conveys someone's values, their lived experiences, and that emotional aspect of someone's story can really hold a lot of weight and power and impact for the listener. I think storytelling is one really resonant way of content. Another resonant content type I find is content that makes you think. Like it makes you think, huh, I never thought about it that way before. Giving you a different perspective or giving you another prompt or probe to look at something from a different angle. I think those very thought-provoking pieces also are very resonant because people this is something that you've said before, Jeremy, which is people like to acquire new knowledge and new information. And I think storytelling gives people something new in the sense that they feel some type of way. But whereas for the more critical, reflective pieces that makes people think or gives people a different perspective, people are acquiring new perspectives. And I think these are content types I find that are more and more resonant in the growing AI, content age. I think these content types I find are even more and more important.
Yeah. And, when you look at all of this, obviously we see like a lot of short videos coming up, obviously see more algorithms. How do you feel like your art or podcasting will continue to evolve from your perspective?
I think there will still be a time and place for short videos as there will be for long form podcasting or long form video or even written content. I think for myself, for example, I'm just one data point, but this one data point does not like short form video. Like I just don't consume it. I don't consume most short form videos that I come across. There are some that I think are very hooky, like they will hook me in and then I'll actually watch. But I think there are a lot of short form videos where it just doesn't capture my attention or interest. So I think I think for podcasters who are thinking, how do I grow my podcast? How do I balance the short form and long form content in my content strategy? I think I've heard a lot of people say that you need to have short form video to grow your podcast. I think to a certain extent that might be true, but I think there are also still a lot of examples of creators who don't use or leverage short form videos to grow their long form platforms. So I personally am a little bit conflicted myself because I see people making either work for them. For me personally, just because I'm a little more biased towards long form content and a little bit more resistant towards short form, I personally have not incorporated as much. I have not successfully incorporated short form into my own business or content strategy. But I do think it depends on your strengths. If you're really good at short form, leverage it. If it's not exactly your forte, maybe focus on better quality long form content.
Yeah. And then, when you think about going from point A to point B, I'm just kind of curious beyond, I think the podcast itself, what are some other goals that you have in the next few years, either in your personal life or in your coaching business or whatever it is?
I think like many podcasters, I would definitely like to grow my podcast. I think that is the obvious goal is to grow in the numbers in terms of marketing my podcast, getting it out to more people. That is something that I have not prioritized for the past 4 years, honestly. So I think that would be something I want to start to think more about and think, what can I actually do? What are effective ways to get my content out to more people? That is for sure one goal. Another goal that I have. So one childhood goal that I have is, if anyone ever asked me, what did you want to be when you were younger? I would say I want to be an editor of a textbook. Like, I've always loved looking at how textbooks are laid out. And I'm like, oh, I love how this flowed, or like how they structured it, or how they added this little box here with extra notes, and how they laid out the diagrams and how the diagram was annotated. I've always really loved textbooks. Not necessarily studying from the textbook, but like I like looking at textbooks. So I think one thing that I can see myself incorporating more of in the future as a goal is, how can I be more involved in creating like more medium types. I don't know if I'm going to evolve into like a media agency or like a content production house. I don't know, but there's just that innate desire to have more of that to use those editorial skill sets. So I really hope that I can bring that into my career moving forward. I don't know what that's going to look like, but that is something that will bring me so much joy and delight.
You mentioned your childhood. What are some childhood beliefs that you've kept? And what's one childhood belief that you've changed or had to shed over time?
Okay. So my parents are immigrants so I was born in North America. I was born in the US. I grew up in Canada. So my parents were immigrants to North America. And I wonder if this is something that is particular to the Asian adults that I grew up with, or if it's more common than I think. But what I observed growing up is that a lot of the adults, especially the Asian adults around me, they will always place such heavy emphasis on hard work, being committed to whatever you're doing, and also to hard skills, not so much soft skills. And why I say these things is because fast forward to when I quit law school, I wondered why my parents were so angry. Like, of course, I understood their disappointment. They were furious. They were very ashamed. But I was so curious, why is it impacting them so much? Like, why is it so painful for them? And I started to wonder if that sentiment that I observed when I was younger, which is a lot of the Asian adults, especially the immigrants, the Asian adult immigrants to North America, they felt like compared to their Western colleagues who were born and raised in North America, they felt like they had to compete on their work ethic. Whereas I find that the stories I hear from them, at least, they'll say like, oh, so-and-so colleague at work is really good at talking their way to the promotion or whatever. Like I hear these kind of sentiments, right, when I was younger. And so over the years, I internalized work ethic, which I still am an advocate for. I think work ethic is very important. But one thing I became more and more curious about is working your butt off, is hard work the only way you can compete in society? And I think so when I quit law school, I think what I became really curious about is this is coming out really clunky, but I think what I'm trying to articulate is the belief that hard work is the only solution to success in your career. I started to really question that. And I started to wonder, is there other perspectives or ways of doing things or ways of being that we can take from other folks, right? For example, for the people that my parents or the adults around me used to kind of like judge and like kind of like feel like a little bit like they were competing against, I wonder if maybe like having those soft skills, having an understanding of your strengths actually is something that you should consider. And I think that was something I had to explore when I was quitting law school is, what are my strengths? Am I playing to my strengths? Is it worth playing to my strengths? Or should I just be working my butt off in law school? Because that could work. I could make that work. But is there another way of doing things? So I think that was something that from my childhood, I started to really question over the years.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, could you share a personal story about a time that you've been brave?
There are definitely a lot of times where things fell out of my comfort zone, but I would specifically say this one thing. Some people may laugh at this, but putting my face on Instagram stories video specifically, I started doing this around 2019. I think putting myself on video on the internet for the first time is terrifying. It is very, very terrifying. But the reason why I wanted to try out this medium of content of social media is because I knew that if I wanted to better my speaking skills, I wanted to increase my confidence speaking and presenting myself online, how I show up, I needed to really accelerate that learning curve. So as much as it was terrifying at the time to show myself on video, I committed to doing it for 1 week every single day. And that led to week number 2, and then number 3, and then 2 months went by. And then what happened was I ended up doing video Instagram stories every single day for like 2-3 years up until 2023. So I think the reason why I wanted to share this for this particular question is because a lot of times our goals or the things that we want to do is immensely out of our comfort zone. But are you willing to at least try? And for me, I think there was a lot of times in my career, in my business, in my personal life where at least I tried, at least I had the courage to try.
Yeah, amazing. And when you say that it was terrifying to put your face on that, why was it terrifying for you?
I think a mixture of things. I think number one was a lot of insecurities about how I look. I think at the time I was quite overweight at that point in my personal life journey. I was much more heavier, and I think it reflected in my body. And I think that was one thing, was I was very insecure about how I looked. And also at the time, my speaking skills, the way I articulate, even enunciate my words, my facial expressions, none of that is it's light years ahead today, but it wasn't like that before. And I always consider myself a very weak public speaker. So at the time, I had a lot of reasons not to try video. I had a lot of reasons to just do Instagram graphics and like written content. But I knew that if I wanted to better myself in certain skill sets, I had to really put myself out of my comfort zone. So I think in that way, that was the terrifying part of it. And sure, like fear of judgment, what will people think? Sure. But I think it was mostly for me personally, a lot of insecurities about myself, a lot of negative thoughts I had about myself at the time.
Yeah. On that note, thank you so much for sharing. I'd love to kind of like summarize the 3 big takeaways from this conversation. First of all, thank you so much for sharing about what it was like to obviously get your undergraduate degree, but also drop out of law school as well as a PhD. And I thought it was fascinating because you're such an open book about your reasons why, how they were different. And more importantly, I think showing the journey and self-discovery that was required to be brave in making those decisions, even though it was contrary to what your peers thought, what your parents would have wanted for you, and even your own self-beliefs. Secondly, thanks for so much sharing about podcasting and how the podcast has evolved thanks to the lessons you've learned along the way, as well as some of the insights that you shared about how you think the medium will shift, as well as how your own strengths and improvement points factor into the podcast. Lastly, thanks for sharing about your own belief structure, about how your childhood beliefs play a role in who you are, and how those show up in your interactions with your parents, how they potentially grew up, and the choices that you're making in your life today. On that note, thank you so much, Cheryl, for sharing your journey.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was a lot of fun.